All right. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the two speakers, which I think have provided the most exciting titles for their papers, at least. We have as the first speaker now, of course, Associate Professor Greg Fealy here from the ANU, who probably doesn't need an introduction. Most of you will know him. He is now currently also here the head of the Department of Political and Social Change. Mostly widely known, I think, for his work on Islamic politics, but today he's going to give us his take on Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the man and the president, and how his personal attitudes shaped his presidency. And following Greg, we have all the way from London, a very warm welcome to John Sidel, who is currently the Sir Patrick Gillam Professor of International and Comparative Politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he will contextualize Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's presidency in a broader comparative perspective. So taken together, I think these two presentations should give us a very good grounding for the rest of discussion and probably link up very well with Iwo Dewi's talk. So, Greg, please.
In the twilight of his presidency, SBY has been reflecting on his position in Indonesian history and indeed on the world stage. And he sees himself as holding an exalted position as one of Indonesia's great presidents, if not the greatest. Moreover, he is convinced that he bears comparison with other leading contemporary figures across the globe, such as Barack Obama, Lee Kuan Yew, Angela Merkel, Tony Blair, Manmohan Singh and the like. He sees these figures as his peers because, like them, he has had a major impact on his own country, but also strides the stages of the world as an equal to them. This lofty opinion of his achievements stands in contrast to the widespread opinion of scholars and pundits that SBY has been a good but not a great president. And this is certainly my own view. SBY has done well, but not very well. I could refer to the things, I have a section here talking about the things he's given credit for, but Ed mentioned them earlier this morning, and then Budewi has gone into greater detail. So I'll pass over that because I have quite a bit to say in this presentation. But it seems to me the reason that he hasn't been a great president is because he's been indecisive and dithering. The term that Ed used before, paragu, is one that you hear all the time mentioned when you're talking to people who are close to SBY. He lacks the gumption to take really bold decisions that are the mark of a great national leader. Let me tell just one anecdote to illustrate the story. I heard this from a very senior diplomat who was given the job of heading up the negotiation team for the Indonesian government, negotiating with the Free Aceh movement with GUM, and this anecdote comes from 2003. And the diplomat told me of his encounters with SBY. SBY at the time was the coordinating Minister of Politics and Security, and it was his job to give guidance to the negotiating team. So the team met SBY and they gave him quite a detailed briefing about what was a complex subject, and they were immensely impressed at how quickly he grasped the detail and the good questions he asked about further information that he needed to have. So then they sought guidance from him about what the government's attitude would be. He then asked them for an opinion paper, and they provided the opinion paper, or options paper, sorry, and then they had another meeting with him. They sought guidance and he wanted further detail in the opinion paper, in the options paper, and this went on for several weeks, and it got to the day when they had to fly out of Jakarta to go for their meeting in Europe with the GUM representatives, and they were at the airport and they still hadn't received word from the president. So the diplomat, in some desperation, called the president's office, called SBY's office, eventually got put through, and he said, "Pat, we need your instructions. We're about to fly out for these negotiations and you haven't told us what position we are to take." SBY said, what position do you think we should take? And he said, well, option 1. And SBY said with some relief, good, take position 1. And so the diplomat said with some exasperation to me several months later, this man simply cannot make a decision. He understands, but he cannot decide. And so, to my mind, that encapsulates the nature of the problem for SBY. And so that's the issue that I've been looking at in my research. How do we explain his hesitancy, and how do we also explain the hubris that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk? He is, after all, a president who has secured 2 handsome popular mandates. He's a 4-star general. He has a PhD from an eminent university and innumerable honours and awards in what can only be described as a glittering military and civilian career. So why should he lack self-regard? This is the question. And I've concluded, after interviewing quite a few ministers, staff close to him, advisors, reading some of the things that he himself has written and other people have written about him, often at his behest, that the key to understanding both SBY's hesitancy and his hubris is his insecurity. The President is beset with self-doubt that he seeks to manage by reducing criticism or attacks on himself, and also by attempting to display superiority or grandiosity that cloaks his emotional fragility. That's the core argument. So in trying to explore this topic, I've had to delve into political psychology, very inexpertly, I must say. I've never done this before, but I see it as really the only way to try to explain these aspects of SBY, the politician. So if some of you are experts in this field, I'll look forward to your comments later. Should have a more interesting slide up there. So where does SBY's insecurity come from? Almost certainly from his childhood. And this is a murky part of SBY's story, because he's revealed very little of his past, either in his writings or to those who are close to him. Sometimes it's not so much what he's written, but what he leaves out, which is most revealing. So let me adumbrate what we know about his past. He was born into a humble and unhappy family in Pacitan in East Java in September 1949. And both the family and the location would have a powerful effect on his development. His father, Sukocho, was said to be a man of rigid views, but also clearly a man of low attainment. Despite claiming an aristocratic lineage, he would bear the title Raden. He rose no further than first sub-lieutenant in 26 years in the army. The meagre salary that he had meant the family endured continuously straitened circumstances. About SBY's mother, Habiba, little is known. She's almost written out of his biographies. Indeed, I cannot find an early photograph of her. When SBY was about 11, he was entrusted to his uncle, who was the village head of Ploso in Pacitan. And the village head, his name's Satrio, he already had 2 other sons, so SBY very much had to fend for himself. His parents divorced when he was 16, and he referred to this as, quote, the worst experience of his life. In the comments about his parents, there is no sign of warmth or affection. The nearest he comes is grudgingly acknowledging that his father's tough attitudes helped to make him independent from an early age. There are a few other interesting snippets from his early history. SBY is described as a boy who disliked violence and disliked also uncompromising views. These, of course, were in stark contrast to his father. He didn't like playing any kind of physical contact sport, such as soccer. There's an anecdote how he was punched by another boy at school, and even though he was much larger than the boy, he refused to hit him back. And what's more, the next day they were the best of friends again. He also loved pageantry and ceremonies. He was a member of the Scouts, and he loved to be at the front of the troop of Scouts. Wanted to be the Commando Upacara. He wanted to be the kind of like the MC in these events. The most important thing was his burning desire to escape Pacitan and to menjadi orang, a term that recurs throughout the writing of SBY's early years, to become someone, to become somebody. He must have felt that his mother and his father were failures in their careers and failures as parents. There's much psychological literature on the connection between insecurity and poor relations with one's parents, especially in these formative years. And Pacitan itself was a hard scrabble place with very few opportunities, a poor area. He wrote after his parents' divorce, "I have to fight, I have to become better, I have to leave Pacitan and become somebody." To his advantage was the fact that he was very smart, very hard-working, well-liked by his peers and his teachers. SBY did well at school, eventually freed himself from Pacitan. He was accepted into the military academy, Akabri, in 1970, and he excelled there. Graduated top of his class the final year in 1973. Let me just show you a couple of other photos. This is the house that he grew up with in his pater, his uncle, in Poso. You see quite a humble house. This is the room he had, 2 by 3 metre room. And SBY and Ibu Ani, his wife, went back there in 2005 and they had a little photo taken. Look how far I've come kind of photo. And here he is having the medal pinned on his chest for becoming the Dux of Akabri in 1973, and it's being pinned on by the governor of the academy, Lieutenant General Sawa Eddy at that time. Perhaps more important for SBY than being the best student was the fact that he gained the favour of Sawa Eddy, the governor. And this led to the courting of Sawa Eddy's daughter, Christiani, or Ani, as she was well known. And SBY and Ani eventually married in 1975 at Sawa Eddy's urging. Interestingly, even at this point, SBY's father, Sukotjo, tried to talk him out of marriage. He warned him about marrying above his station. And so we can see how here was SBY trying to rise above his humble origins, and his father was seeking to drag him back down to them again, despite all the success that his son had had at school and at military academy. So there's a photo of the happy day. So Sawa Eddy on that side, and there's Sukotjo, and one of the few photos of SBY's mother from this period, Habiba, beside him. So this Sawa Eddy clan was almost everything that SBY's own family hadn't been. It was tight-knit, wealthy, socially and politically successful, and had a blue blood pedigree through the Distaff side. At its head was Sawa Eddy, one of the most powerful and charismatic generals of his generation, and he utterly dominated the family. So here are one of numerous photos of the extended family taken at the Chikeas compound that they have, and you'll see behind the statue or the bust of Sawa Eddy. Here's a more recent photo, and once again, behind is Sawa Eddy. Deeply symbolic, and you'll see there's SBY's mother Habiba, somewhat crumpled beside him. These figures are actually photos are quite symbolic, I think. So there was a mutual interest in this family. The family's high status could, of course, propel SBY quickly through the ranks of the military. And for the family, SBY's bright prospects helped to secure their military and possibly political future, because none of Sawa Eddy's own sons were particularly gifted in either field, I would venture. But SBY didn't enter this family as an equal. He came as a subordinate. That battler background, that poor background from Pacitan. And I think right from the start, Ibu Ani was ascendant over him. She was the one who called the shots, not SBY. And so being in the Sawa Eddy clan may have helped SBY's career, but I think it fed his insecurities. SBY's military career flourished, not so much on the battlefield, but in UN peacekeeping operations, which he was particularly proud, and also in social political affairs. There are quite a few interesting anecdotes from the military, particularly from East Timor, where SBY was reprimanded for not seizing the moment in leading his units in operations against Fretland. So even as early as that, we see signs that he wasn't decisive. He entered politics in 2000 when Gusdur made him Minister for Mines, and then coordinating minister for Menko Polkam for political affairs and security, and that was a position he also held in the Megawati government. He was elected, of course, in 2004 and then re-elected in 2009. So his 2 5-year terms had markedly different dynamics, and Ed touched on some of these issues earlier. The first of the 5-year terms was by far the more productive and successful. Major policy issues were tackled. Much of the government's legislative agenda got through Parliament. It was a period of reasonably substantial achievement. The success was due partly to the composition of the cabinet and also to SBY's own approach to the presidency. With regards to the composition of cabinet, 3 people were crucial. The first was Vice President Yusuf Kalla, second was the Coordinating Minister of Social Affairs, Abu Rizal Bakri, and the third was the presidential spokesman, Andi Malarangeng. So Kalla and Bakri were the can-do, cut-through men in this government. Kalla was an impatient, insistent person who was constantly pushing SBY to do things, to take action, and putting in place the kind of policy settings that enabled those things to happen. Abu Rizal Bakri was the political manager. He and his staff and his Golkar confreres knew how to manage Parliament, who to cajole, who to pay off and the like, so bills would get through. And Andi Malarangeng, he played a much bigger role than just being a presidential spokesman, because he could detect problems in the making and he could quickly act to solve them, liaising with ministers, senior bureaucrats, the media, and particularly with SBY. And SBY trusted him implicitly, trusted him like no other younger person that he has in the 10 years of his presidency. Andi had a particular skill, perhaps surprising in a Buginese, but one who'd spent a lot of his time in Java, that he knew how to package bad news for the president. He knew how to package unpalatable options in a way that SBY found easy to accept. And people repeatedly talked about how effective Andi was at this. So that's the composition of people around SBY. Then there was SBY himself. Of course, he was risk averse and prone to zigzag on policy decisions, particularly when there was public controversy. He was always being buffeted by public opinion, and ministers were always complaining about SBY being blown off course by strong media coverage on a particular matter. The back down on the labour law was a classic example of this. But ministers also said that this was a period in which SBY was open to discussion, in which he would accept opinions contrary to his own. And in cabinet meetings, there was often genuine debate. SBY was very systematic in giving ministers an opportunity to vent their views, especially during the first few years of his presidency. Ministers also had very good access to the president if they needed them. So I heard quite a few ministers say that this was a stimulating time and a time in which they were proud of their achievements. It's something that you don't very often hear from his second term. So to this second term, I think the election itself had a powerful effect on SBY's psychology. He felt it had elevated him to a unique place in Indonesian history, and indeed in one way it had. Not only the only president re-elected, but also with the resounding victory, that 61% mandate. And indeed, he saw himself as indeed having menjadi orang, really become someone with this election. And so there was a deep and cosseting self-satisfaction that he derived from this. Staff and ministers noted that he became much more aloof and hubristic in his behaviour. He was more remote from cabinet and inclined to lecture rather than listen. Cabinet meetings became long and often boring disquisitions by the president, and he was nicknamed, somewhat ruefully, the Professor because of the way in which he lectured the ministers. And most of the decisions were decided well beforehand. He disapproved strongly of any contrary opinions from ministers or advisors, and those who needed to tell him something he didn't want to hear had to be very artful in the way they went about it, lest he become angry or dismissive. And if he became angry, he would often cut off contact with them. He became extremely fearful of crossing public opinion. This has always been an element in SBY's makeup. But in the second term in particular, he was constantly commissioning new polls. He almost never went against majority views. And I have some lovely anecdotes about this, but I don't quite have time to convey them. The new cabinet also had far less effective personnel. It didn't really have those fixers and operators that the first cabinet had had. Yusuf Kala had been replaced by Budiono, who, as Budewi has told us, had no political base of his own and was not a political operator. In this decision, this was an act of complacency on SBY's part. He didn't want his feathers ruffled by another Yusuf Kala type figure, and he was confident that he could run the government entirely by himself. In fact, this would give him the opportunity to show how competent he was. Agung Laksono was supposed to replace Abu Rizal Bakri as the person who dealt with Parliament, but he turned out to be very incompetent on it. And Daniel Sparinga turned out to be much less effective a liaison person than Andi Malaranging had been. SBY was also increasingly given to comparing himself with world leaders. Staff often referred somewhat jokingly to SBY's Obama fever. He loved any praise from Obama and would often come in and show staff with a beaming smile about what kind words Obama may have said to him. He tried to copy elements of the Obama style, including the Twitter, becoming a Twitterer. Is that the correct word for it? And he slavishly studied the subscription figures to Twitter. And he once boasted that he had even more followers than Obama. So this really meant something to him. And he derided in private David Cameron because he didn't have a Twitter account. So SBY really felt he was up there with them. So he's also preoccupied with awards and titles. In fact, he had staff penghargaan, staff to seek out honours and awards for him. And that was their job. And he would travel around the world receiving these honorary doctorates. There he is with all his medals on there. Here he is receiving the Knight of the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, another ridiculous title from Great Britain. In 2012, getting an honorary doctorate, I think it's from Sydney University, perhaps Simon Butt might be able to confirm that, or UNSW. And in fact, on cue, SBY is, I think today, getting yet another honorary doctorate from a university in Japan. So he's running true to form. So let me now return. So the staff felt that he is... Thanks, okay. Can I have 1.5 minute more? Sorry. So the staff felt by about 2011, SBY thought he'd done it all and he could cruise. So let me just return quickly to these three key terms in the title: majoritarian democracy, insecurity and hubris, because I think they define his presidency. SBY sees himself as a Democrat for various reasons, but he's particularly proud of the issue that he followed the majority. For him, being a good Democrat was following what the majority wanted, reflecting broad mass of opinion. He believes this kept society stable and was a precondition to Indonesia's prosperity. But it was also a way of dealing with his insecurity and indecisiveness. Let the public decide via opinion polls. And it took the decisions to some extent out of his hands. So he was casting as a virtue what in fact for him was almost a psychological necessity. His insecurity was a product, I think, of this unstable, seemingly loveless childhood. He found little to admire and probably much to dislike in his parents. Psychologists say poor parental relations are a major cause of self-doubt in adult life. I think SBY was very aware of his insecurities and his vacillatory tendencies, and he tried to compensate for them. But in fact, this left him a follower rather than a leader. Last of all, narcissism or hubris. This was one response, his way of managing inadequacy. The acute sensitivity he had to criticism reflected his insecurity, and the sense of grandiosity was designed to be a salve for this anxiety. He was trying to prove to the world, and perhaps prove to himself, that he was an extraordinarily competent and successful person. His obsession with status, ceremony and formality was all about providing reassurance. He liked clear rules and protocols so he could control the environment around him, reducing spontaneity and not letting people get too close to him. And psychologists often say the higher the office, the greater the struggle for someone like SBY to deal with their threatened ego and their insecurities. And so we see this, I think, in SBY's growing concern for grandiosity in his later years. I think he was trying to persuade himself that he'd overcome his weaknesses, but he could never quite succeed in doing so. And it's a cycle from which he can never escape, despite all of his achievements. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Greg. You're making a great psychologist. Maybe you should switch fields. Okay. Without further ado, I hand over to John.
As the one person, hello, the other one. As the one person on the program who has not had the pleasure of really savoring or suffering through the past 10 years of the SBY administration, having spent very little time in Indonesia during that period, I'm probably well suited to follow after Greg's very detailed and personality-focused talk and paper. Because the emphasis in my paper and presentation is on an approach to understanding politics that shifts from a narrow focus on personality to something broader and more structural. And it seems to me that there is a danger of confining one's analysis to personality, as one often seems to do in talking about Indonesian politics lately, including and especially during the past election, if by focusing on personality and personalizing politics, we end up familiarizing and thus normalizing politics, limiting our ability to explain various things, and also perhaps rendering ourselves ill-equipped to anticipate what then suddenly seems surprising when personalities change or the cast of characters change. And here I'm inspired in trying to engage in a more structural approach to understanding the SBY years by a well-known book in the study of American politics by a scholar named Stephen Skowronek, The Politics Presidents Make, where he goes back through 200 years of American presidents and shows that, among other things, those presidents who are seen to have been politically effective, sort of masters of political arts, strong presidents, time and time again came immediately after presidents who were widely derided as putzes. So Thomas Jefferson came after John Adams, Andrew Jackson came after John Quincy Adams, Lincoln came after Buchanan, FDR came after Hoover, and Reagan came after Jimmy Carter. And so this kind of pattern suggests that we need to look beyond the individual, and we might begin to discern structural patterns through some kind of comparative analysis. A comparative analysis which in the case of Indonesia is not really facilitated by the paucity of presidents. And so it seems to me we can look elsewhere and begin to see patterns that we can see in the broader Southeast Asian contexts. And here I'd like to suggest that there are ways in which comparing or seeing parallels between SBY and the longtime Prime Minister Prem in Thailand in the 1980s, and the single term, in the Philippines you only get a single 6-year term president, Fidel Ramos, might be illuminating in some ways. So let me get going on that task. If we look at Prem, Ramos, and SBY, in all three cases we see, of course, as the uniform suggests, recent retired or retiring senior armed forces officers, serving out maximum permissible terms in office, dominating national politics for the better part of a decade, and then enjoying influence beyond. These former army generals are seen to represent in their terms in office periods of stability. They're seen to be representing moderation, a measure of respectability, and a kind of consensus-focused kind of national executive leadership. In all three cases, these national executives leave office willingly at the end of their terms. They're acknowledged and applauded as protectors of constitutional rule, as promoters of economic growth and development, and as avowed supporters of initiatives and aspirations broadly understood under the rubric of reform. In all three cases, the rise of these so-called professional soldiers is widely celebrated at the time when they rise to power as a kind of welcome relief from the more divisive and obviously dirty forms of politics which preceded their administration. And when they leave office years later, their departure is met with a sense of either regret or at least nervousness about what might follow, and as I'll suggest, perhaps rightly so. Overall, then, if we look at the three countries in Southeast Asia, the only three countries that have had periods of competitive electoral politics that we could call democracies, except recently Thailand, it seems that there's always an SBY-like figure in the mix. And this suggests two things. One, beyond this conference, that if Burma ever gets there, they'll have an SBY-like president in due course. But also, if we think of Indonesia, which is what interests, if not obsesses, all of you, then you could say that if SBY did not exist, perhaps someone would have had to invent him, or someone like him, to fill that structural niche that was there for him to seize upon when he became president in 2004. So how to explain this pattern, understand it historically, and appreciate its significance? In all three cases, the broader context in which these men emerged and evolved into positions of power, these professional soldiers emerged and ascended, was one of protracted authoritarian rule, a succession of military-led governments in Thailand from 1947 up to 1973. In the case of the Philippines, we see Marcos declaring martial law in 1972, and then, of course, Suharto seizing power in late 65 and consolidating power over the course of 1966. Under all of these authoritarian regimes, the armed forces, of course, occupied key positions of power and influence in national local politics. They enjoyed considerable insulation from civilian oversight. They enjoyed impunity from prosecution or investigation, even in terms of commission of large-scale human rights abuses. In all these cases, the raison d'etre of the armed forces was not external defense, but rather internal security defined in ways which helped to circumscribe various forms of opposition to authoritarian rule. Thus, crucially, in all these cases, in all these countries, the transitions from authoritarian rule to democracy structurally required, necessitated the participation of senior military officers willing to engage with opposition forces, willing to abstain from efforts to repress protests in the streets, willing to abandon authoritarian rulers, and willing to aid and abet in the forced removal of entrenched dictators and the often impromptu, makeshift, provisional arrangements enabling transitions to democracy. So if you think of the people power that unfolded in Bangkok in 1973, it wouldn't have succeeded without the betrayal of Tanom and Prapat by General Krit, who allowed the demonstrations to succeed. In 1986, people power in Manila would not have succeeded without the failed coup attempt of the army colonels associated with the Reform the Armed Forces Movement, or the RAM, in Manila. And arguably in May 1998, you wouldn't have seen the transition from Suharto to Habibie and beyond if General Wiranto and others hadn't told Suharto that indeed he had to go. So, in all three cases, however, this seemingly progressive role of putative softliners in the military establishment during the fall of these dictatorships was soon complemented by the regressive role of assertive so-called hardliners who worked to undermine, if not overthrow, the early civilian-led transitional governments as they struggled to establish their authority. We see in all three cases, we see senior military officers stubbornly resisting efforts to reduce the insulation and impunity of the security forces, sharply criticizing civilian leaders for their policy failings and political leanings, and strongly asserting their own prerogatives in terms of control over policy, personnel, and power. In all three cases, the early years following the fall of these authoritarian regimes witness forms of nonviolent and violent mobilization which prompts armed interventions by the security forces, thus involving senior military officers in matters of internal security in ways which inevitably enhance their public prominence and political authority. Finally, in all three cases, these developments, as among others Marcus Meitzner has strongly emphasized, impelled vulnerable civilian leaders of transitional governments to forge alliances, opportunistically and otherwise, with senior military officers whose influence in the armed forces could potentially offset that of hardliners, and thus provide much-needed protection from military foot-dragging, mischief, and coup attempts, and also protection and leverage against civilian opposition as well. If we think beyond these parallels, we see that the years leading up to the fall of the dictators of Tanaman Prapat, of Marcos, and Suharto see the emergence of popular opposition figures from the realm of civil society and civilian-led political parties who claim to articulate the broad aspirations and grievances of the Thai, Filipino, and Indonesian people against the narrowly personalistic interests of the dictators and their families and cronies. But with the shift to civilian rule, competitive elections, unfettered media coverage of politics, the notion of some kind of unified people, electorate, universal interests, and unself-interested politicians and political parties inexorably fades away, even as the fractiousness of democratic politics, the foibles and failings of elected politicians, they're always said to be mercurial, erratic, sort of comes into focus. And against this backdrop, in all of these cases, this palpable sense of disillusionment, disappointment, and loss leads to a growing sense of nostalgia and yearning for something, for someone, somehow above politics. Some notion of a kind of Archimedean point, a view from nowhere, from which the national interest and the popular will could be represented. At the same time, the reconfiguration of what political scientists rather boringly call state-society relations alters the boundaries between state and society, expands the opportunity for state capture by social, often very obvious, powerful social forces, political interests, and it undermines notions of the state qua state. And in all three cases, these developments provoke a kind of counter-reaction, ideologically and politically, with efforts made to reassert the power of the state and certain notions of stateness, with reform typically championed as a mantra best championed by elements not in society, not in political parties, but from within the state. And these deeper political sort of tectonic shifts, it seems to me, provide a backdrop against which we might understand the rise of these men on horseback, these professional soldiers. It's against this backdrop that the ascendancy of men like Prem, Ramos, and SBY arguably wasn't only possible, but inevitable. And here the individual personal histories and public profiles of these men fit the job profile to a T. All these three men embarked on their military careers during periods of expanding roles for the armed forces and public life. All these men paid their dues in terms of combat and counterinsurgency operations, but all these three men were also drawn into roles which enhanced their contacts, their prominence, and their presentational skills in arenas of civilian public life. Prem in Bangkok and in his relationship with the king, Ramos in ceremonial positions in the armed forces, SBY as a lecturer at Seskoad, as the personal assistant of Edi Sudrajat, and then as Kasospol, of course, in the last years of Suharto. In the final years of authoritarian rule, these men found themselves in positions which enabled, if not impelled them, to mark some distance between themselves and the dictatorships they long served. So Prem was affiliated with General Krit rather than Tenoman Propat. Ramos was vice chief of staff and acting chief of staff when the real power close to Marcos was General Ver. And SBY was always on the side because he was too close to Edi Sudrajat. These men were not in positions from which they were forced to make tough choices about firing on demonstrators and things like that. It was obvious what they would do. So these three men were amply well-positioned and well-suited to play crucial roles as so-called softliners during the critical years of transition from authoritarian rule to democracy. They were consummate insiders with seemingly impeccable credentials as professional soldiers within the military establishment, but they also conveniently occupied safe positions outside the line of command of coup-making colonels and generals. As paper pushers, as parliamentarians, as pretty faces for the military establishment, these three men had more to gain from a gradual, stage-managed disengagement of the armed forces from politics than from a full-blown coup d'etat. Thus, all three men attracted the attention and support of key civilian figures in national politics during transitional periods when more assertive, aggressive, and adventurous officers undertook or threatened efforts to seize power directly through military coups or otherwise tried to consolidate effective power as military strongmen. In all three cases, these men appeared to serve their patrons unself-interestedly, inconspicuously, in a self-effacing way, but at some point they realized their time had come and they seized the moment. In all three cases, when these men launched their bid for office as prime minister or president, they presented themselves as consensus candidates behind whom diverse business and political interests could unite. They forged coalitions with prominent civilian figures, and they adopted a style of leadership variously celebrated as consultative or derided as indecisive, as we've just heard. With prominent civilian figures already disqualified, these professional soldiers presented themselves as honest brokers, reconciling former enemies, including rivals within the military, recruiting into their administration a mix of former military chums, machine politicians, and businessmen. They pursued fairly conventional macroeconomic policies, enabling economic growth. They won qualified praise from various conventional quarters. They arranged peace deals with armed insurgencies, improving their country's international profiles and patching up relations with the United States. They paid lip service to the cause of reform without undermining the establishment or disrupting the status quo. In sharp contrast with their civilian predecessors, these three men, these three professional soldiers represented re-equilibration, restabilization, reconciliation, and a measure of re-centralization of power under a veneer of seemingly more professional and less political leadership. And yet, we might then be surprised that in all three cases it would appear, and certainly the historical record shows, that as these men saw their terms in office draw to a close, we see the onset of periods in politics which are ones in which deep-seated conflicts, tensions, and problems begin to surface. In Thailand, after Prem's 8 years in office, we see the disastrous prime ministership of Chat Chai, and then a coup, and a re-equilibration with a series of unstable governments. Up until now, arguably, we see remnants of those problems. In the Philippines, we see the rise of Joseph Estrada and his eventual failed impeachment and his overthrow through people power. And already in Indonesia in 2014, we've begun to see signs of real trouble. A narrow miss, as was said. So how can we explain this? That after 10 years of placid stability under these professional soldiers, suddenly all hell breaks loose. The temptation is to reach for a personal account of the individuals, but it seems to me that there's a more structural analysis one might undertake instead. In all three cases, these democracies are oligarchical democracies in many ways, in which money and machinery have played crucial roles in elections, and the people occupying positions of political power use those positions of power for personalistic, private, pecuniary interest. And yet, in all three cases, we see how the demographic and social changes rub up against these entrenched oligarchical interests in ways which challenge and contest the meaning of democracy and make new kinds of politics possible. Against this backdrop, it seems to me we might think of these three professional soldiers as in some ways playing a sort of historic role in some ways. But in so doing, we have to reconsider the prevailing understandings of Prem, Ramos, and SBY as simply occupying the moderate center ground, embodying the natural new normal of democratic politics in these countries. Because the oligarchical foundations of these democracies were secured in critical junctures in ways which effectively but artificially disqualified or disabled left-wing movements and parties from the positions in society and roles in democracy they had previously struggled to attain. And so if we see that in all these cases, in different ways, these professional soldiers are closely associated with the violent suppression of the left, we could see that when in fact over time the problems that we've been hearing about all day of social inequality, of social envy, of resentment at the corruption and enduring monopolistic cartel-like position of a political establishment give rise to so-called populist politicians, we might recall that these professional soldiers were deeply implicated in a shift to democracy in all three cases that was only allowed, that was only possible once these countries were made safe, were violently made safe from the possibility of having left-wing politics as a permissible part of the political spectrum at the national level. And then, all right, I know I've got to give up the game. But in this regard, how do I fast forward through all this? It seems to me that it's important to look back on the SBY years in ways which we think of the rise of the dangers of a Prabowo as not just something that is pathologically attributable to some personal circumstances, but something which is not just deferred, potentially, as other analogies might suggest, but which has been enabled by a set of constraints on what democracy was allowed to mean when authoritarian rule gave way to democracy in these countries in ways which distorts the politics of these countries and constrains them so that the inevitable grievances, the inevitable problems associated with social inequality are distorted and in various ways suppressed. And yet, of course, as the psychologists would tell us, with the inevitable return of the repressed, they're displaced, but they reemerge in different ways. And in that sense, we also have SBY to thank or to blame for the rise of Prabowo. Almost in 2014, maybe deferred into years to come. It is said that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce, then as so-called political science. Maybe that's true in this case today.
Okay, thanks, John. We have about 15 minutes time for questions, just in case you're wondering. In the next session, we actually only have one speaker, so that's why we still have a bit of time for questions. So we follow the usual pattern. from the left, from the middle, and from the right. And please keep the questions short, no comments, just questions. Yep.
Sorry, John, I'm going to go back to the salacious. The question to Greg. Just recently I read a very well-written article, the veracity of which I don't know, about SBY being married actually before he went to a carberry. A, is it true? And B, if it is true, where does it fit into the pop psychology?
Okay, we take 2 more questions, if we have them. Yeah, got Merle at the front and one in the middle. Take the one in the middle. Okay. Yeah. Anyone here on the right? No.
Greg, SBY's behaviour as described, the desire to be loved, the pole obsession, the inability to make a decision, sounds a bit like Kevin Rudd. To what extent do you think that is just driven by individual egomania rather than just part of obtaining higher office in this era of increasing narcissism in general society?
Okay, thank you. And one last question from Marlon.
Again, a question for Greg. Psychoanalyzing public figures is a notoriously dangerous thing to do. The SBY public record, of course, is quite clear. We can see how he conducts himself in public. But you were raising hypotheses about his early life. Now, to what extent are those accounts of his early life accounts given by SBY, or are you relying upon accounts of SBY's life composed by other people?
So the question of his early marriage, I think the most detailed source for this is this 3-part history, what is it, from Revolucic to Reformasi by Joseph Daves, a former US military attaché in Jakarta. And in the 3rd volume, he has some detail about SBY being married to a Filipina and having 2 daughters. I think it's wrong. For a number of reasons. First of all, and the story goes, and I asked quite a lot of people about this, and there are lots of stories about how the 2 daughters live in Jakarta, one in Menteng, one in Pondok Indah, and they're called now nieces, and they still see SBY. So there are lots of stories. I think people like to talk about this. But I think it's implausible for a number of reasons. The first is there's only a very short period of time. By the time he graduated from SMA in Pacitan, and then he went to Surabaya, and he went, first of all, he enrolled in an engineering course in ITS, in the Institute of Technology Surabaya, and then he changed to a teacher's course in Malang. So there was about an 18-month period before he was accepted into a kabri. So that's not much time to meet a foreign woman, get married, have 2 kids. Second really conclusive thing to my mind, and you would know this better than me, Bob, is that I'm told there is rigorous examination of everything to do with someone's life before you're accepted into a kabri. And one of the things that is closely scrutinised is whether you've been married or not, whether there is anything in your past that breaches those laws. In fact, one of the people who told me about this had a brother who had secretly married several years before he went into Magelang, and they found out several months before he finished his course, and they dismissed him. And so he failed to graduate because of that one fact, and a number of stories like that. I don't think it was possible for SBY, given the role he had, to have a wife and 2 children in SBY in East Java for that short period of time, and to have also made it into the Akabri. So I think this is fitna, and I can understand why he got so upset about it. I mean, he got too upset about it, and because a Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Zainal Ma'arif, raised it in public, and SBY later sued him for it, and he apologised. And so, yeah, so it's an old story, and I'm glad you raised it, because I don't think it's true. Second, very interesting question about Kevin Rudd. It's interesting, when I was reading a lot of this material about insecurity and narcissism and hubris, one element of narcissism is often explosive temper, which SBY doesn't have, but Kevin Rudd most certainly does have. The two men actually get on very well. Of all the Australian leaders who SBY met, he liked Kevin Rudd the most, and I think there's a genuine connection between them, perhaps because I don't know whether it would be actually interesting to ask Kevin Rudd, did you ever talk about your own difficult, your common difficult childhoods, you know, because Rudd also has a difficult background. It would be a very interesting conversation if it came up. I think there's something distinctive. I mean, politicians, of course, have very big egos. That's part of the game. But I think what singles out SBY from a lot of other politicians is the sheer level of acute sensitivity that he has to any kind of criticism or slight against himself. A lot of leaders don't care that much. I mean, they want to be popular, but it's not something that is deeply anxiety-provoking to them if the polls come back and people have not approved. But for SBY, that can destroy his mood for weeks on end, in fact. And you only need to read his book, Selalu Ala Pilihan, to see this almost formulaic approach where he goes through all the controversial decisions. He labels his own decisions as rational, carefully thought through, and the decisions of his critics as emotional, irrational, and the like. Time after time, that's the way he sees the world. And I think it's constructed. This is the way he deals with the world. So I think we can look at him as an individual, in a way, and rather than to see him as a product of broader contemporary conditions. I hope that's some kind of adequate answer. The last question is responding to Merle about where these accounts come from. The font of most of the accounts is the book that's most commonly cited, or not cited, but clearly material is taken from it, is SBY Sang Democrat, SBY the Democrat. And this was written by, the head of the writing team was this guy, Usama Hisham, who was a Democrat Party politician and failed Tangerang mayoral candidate a few years ago. My understanding of how the book, there are direct quotes from SBY in there, and I'm presuming that, I know the team had extensive access to him. This was written before the 2004 election, and so this was clearly a campaign document. And so we indeed have to factor that in. But in the absence of any other information, this is, for the moment, the best we have to go on. And I don't think SBY will reveal any more of himself, particularly the truth of what was going on in his childhood, in anything he writes from here on in, because he has an image to protect. And he's very big on pencitraan. And Ibu Ani is obsessive about pencitraan. So I don't think anyone particularly wants a frank, bare-all account out there. Having said that, there are a lot of useful pieces of information in Sang Democrat, and I mentioned quite a few of them: the love of ceremony, the failure to speak in heartfelt terms about either of his parents, the almost total lack of mention of his mother, in a way. I think these are in fact very telling. There are a few other accounts from his auntie, for example, where he lived. The Compass journalist interviewed her, and there are little snippets of information that tend to bear out this picture. I've talked to a number of people who have been quite close to him for a number of years, and they also give the same impression. It was an unhappy childhood. He didn't much like his parents. He felt very much shortchanged as a child. So that's why I think there's enough for us to go on to at least venture this line of analysis. I'd be very happy if much more practiced political psychologists came along and undertook a more detailed study, but I hope that this has started some kind of discussion about what's going on within SBY's mind, because I think it's actually quite fascinating.
Okay, now I'll see a few more. So we'll start here on the right, because we didn't have anyone on the right first. The mic there. Now we have too many. Just two more. Maybe at the back there. Oh no, you've already asked in the previous round, so you're not. So in the middle and at the far back.
Aaron Conley from the Lowy Institute in Sydney. Greg, that was a really great paper. I'm curious, when you talk about SBY and his apparent need to suppress information about his childhood for political or social reasons, I wonder if you think that perhaps Indonesia is changing to the point where that's no longer a necessity, where Jokowi, for instance, did the opposite and has really tried to play up his modest childhood and upbringing. And I think people were generally surprised to find out in June that he was worth something like $1.5 million. It was not something that he talked about a lot. So is this changing in Indonesia? Do we see folks who don't feel like they have to suppress this sort of impoverished childhood?
Thank you. Is the mic arrived in the middle? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, Jock Cheatham from Sydney Morning Herald. I wonder if it's, and from Uni of Sydney, I wonder if it's possible to join your two positions, come up with a love child, along the lines of that, yes, indeed, SBY was insecure and dithering, and that some of the elites that supported him knew that, and they saw that as an opportunity to have a leader who wasn't going to interfere with them just going on making money. And, you know, if you think that's worth exploring, who were these people just going back 10 years, you know, and how have they fared?
And one more question.
My name is Miles Cooper. John, I found your comparison of the political cycles of the three countries quite fascinating. Worked in all three of them. Thailand's political cycle moves faster than most, which makes me wonder, is there a Thaksin in Indonesia's future? Maybe Jokowi's Thaksin.
Is there a toxin? Well, if you look across the three cases, this supposed populist assumes different forms in different contexts. In the Philippines, it's a movie actor because the Philippines has by far the most fun movies of any country in Southeast Asia. In the case of Thaksin, he's a Chinese businessman in a country where the king is Chinese, everyone who's anyone, all politicians are Chinese. Oh, yeah, sorry. But having that Chinese ancestry doesn't disqualify you from being, you know, a Thai in the same awful problematic way that Chineseness has been a perennial problem. And actually, you know, maybe today is worth thinking that one of the best things that's happened under SBY is the new citizenship law as part and parcel of a broader process of, you know, increasing assimilation and active incorporation of ethnic Chinese Indonesians into politics. But I think Prabowo is that figure. What I did in the paper and wanted to get to do in my ill-timed talk was to get to the case of Richard Nixon. And, you know, Richard Nixon, like Prabowo, was a perennial loser in American politics. And his political obituary was written many times. But in the second of the, so far, 3-book series by this guy, Rick Perlstein, the book is titled Nixonland, where he charts the rise of conservatism in American politics. He says, well, by the time 1968 rolled up, there were enough Americans who were kind of sufficiently embittered, you know, of interlopers who had a miserable childhood like Nixon, who felt themselves outsiders against the liberal establishment, and enough who rallied with him in the sense of embitterment against, you know, the civil rights movement, the anti-war and the counterculture, and who could identify with his twisted personality. And I think that, you know, the numbers of people who could identify with that, you know, that kind of character, you know, were, you know, in the Indonesian case, significant already in 2014. I would think, you know, you've got 5 years, but don't write him off. Or write off that kind of politics. And don't think that it's a matter of personality. It is a matter of what Indonesia has done to institutionalize forms of representing social grievances having to do with social inequality. You know, you make your bed, you lie in it.
The question about SBY suppressing him from information about his childhood and whether it's acceptable in the modern political era. In a way, what he's doing is creating a story for himself, and it's emphasising his humble backgrounds and how he did it himself. He went from a poor area, from a not supportive family, and he became the most important person in the land. And I think that's the image that he wants to create. So there is a story out there, there is a narrative out there. It's probably not I'm not saying it's not the real one, but it's a very elusive one as to what really happened. And I think the difference between, for example, Jokowi, I know Jokowi has embroidered parts of his own story and about, you know, others being evicted from houses and various other things, I think. Just like Kevin Rudd may well have elaborated parts of his own story. But I think one of the differences is that for SBY, this was acutely humiliating and embarrassing for him, what he went through as a child. And the fact he would still many years later describe the divorce of his parents as the worst experience of his life, even though he hadn't lived with them for 6 or 7 years. That was also, I think, quite telling. At the time they divorced, that was. So there is a story out there. It's just not an especially revealing story, and I don't think SBY has any intention of revealing that story now, because he's happy with the photos with the medals. He wants everyone to remember him as a great president of Indonesia and who rose from something humble, but rather than someone who rose from something that was psychologically scarring for him in his past. The very interesting question about SBY, insecurity and the elites, and I think that's in fact a very profitable line of perhaps further analysis. There was no doubt that SBY had this reputation as a very accommodating figure, as a figure given to compromise, of particularly forthright views, and so that when he gained this popularity in the media, when he gained this popularity in the polls, I think a lot of forces in Indonesian politics regarded him as someone who not only they could work with, but whom they could prosper under. And so I think that is indeed one of the systemic elements of the analysis here that perhaps I should stick into the paper. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the speakers one more time.